Okay, good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks for being here. My name is Warren Klein. I'm the curator of our Bernard Museum here at Temple Emanu-El. I'm excited to welcome you to hear from a man whose family helped chart a new course for so many Jews across the world, and who himself reshaped the way that history is written. Simon Sebag Montefiore then is the perfect Streicker Center guest. Bold, insightful, and adept at giving us new ways to think about the past and the future. As our winter-spring semester draws to a close, please know that we're already lining up more thinkers, writers, artists, and activists for you to enjoy this fall. Most of us first became familiar with Dr. Montefiore when his biography of Jerusalem became a global bestseller. A biography, we wondered? How do you write a biography of a city, especially one so ancient? Then we read his stunning portrait filled with the characters who experienced the city during wars and betrayals, looting, glory, fanaticism, persecution, and spirituality. Now, he has pulled off a similar feat with the story of humanity over the course of 1,000,000 years through the tale of 23 families. The world, a family history of humanity, ranges across time and space from prehistoric to the present. Upon the US release of this extraordinary volume, he joins us tonight to discuss those families, how humankind has and has not changed over the millennia, and the challenge of capturing the whole human story in a single narrative. A descendant of Moses Montefiore, who built the first planned Jewish settlement outside of the old walls of Jerusalem, Simon has been a banker, a foreign affairs journalist, and a war correspondent. He is the author of 6 earlier works of nonfiction and 3 novels. We'll begin this evening with a few questions that have been submitted by our virtual audience, and then we'll open it up for questions from our in-person guests. Please join me in welcoming Simon Sebag Montefiore. Good evening.
Essential.
Enjoy. So this is quite the book. I mean, I'm enjoying it, the weightedness on my lap right now, and where to begin with so many questions. But, one I thought in reading the introduction, what drove you to history at such an early age?
I think partly, I should say, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Absolutely.
And I'm very honored to have you, the curator of the museum here, doing this, because obviously I love Jewish history. It's one of the things I love. But also to be here and to see the sanctuary of the temple. I mean, I've written a lot about the temple in Jerusalem, but Herod the Great never saw this, and he'd have been impressed. So it's great to be here. But to start your question, thanks for that. This is a book I've really kind of always wanted to write. I was brought up in a household that loved books, that loved history, and I think, the family history of both my parents, in their very different ways, both of which have a part in the book. In fact, it helped inspire me. I mean, my mother's family were Lithuanian Jews who escaped from the Russian Empire, who famously bought a ticket to New York and left Lithuania in a ship. And after about 2 days at sea, they were told they'd arrived in New York, and they were outraged, and they grumbled to the people smugglers. And the people smugglers said, "No, we haven't tricked you. Look at your ticket." And it was only then that these Lithuanian Jews looked at the ticket and saw that it said New Cork and not New York on the ticket. Now, this sounds like an apocryphal Jewish family story. It actually isn't. I actually researched it thinking it was just a sort of joke family story. That's exactly what happened. So they settled in Limerick in Ireland, which was very different from Manhattan. And that was their family. And then the Montefiores, of course, were a very different story, a fascinating story, and they've played a part in virtually every one of my books, my history books. Moses Montefiore in the 19th century was one of those kind of Zelig-like characters who appears everywhere and is in every story. So he's in my Romanovs book, he's in my Jerusalem book, and he's in the world too. And I couldn't resist putting him in. So history was always very much part of our upbringing, our household. And my father said to me as a little boy, he once gave me a world history, and he said very gently, he said, maybe you'll write something like this one day.
That's great. I wonder how many families that happened to that ended up in Newkirk, and that happened to. That's really amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So your book uses the family or families to narrate the world history. As we know, families are loving, they're dysfunctional. How did you choose this framework? And maybe you could talk about a few of the families that you chose or didn't choose intentionally.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, what happened with this book was there are many world histories, as you know, and I wanted to find a way to capture the span of global history, but fill in something that is often missing from world histories, and that is, world histories often have great lists of commodities traded and empires falling and epidemics ripping through the populations, sieges and wars and so on. But the actual individuals are sort of missing, and the human beings are missing. On the other hand, biographies, as you know, here in America particularly, biographies are getting longer and longer. You have the great Robert Caro still writing LBJ, which I've read the existing volumes so far, but it's still unfinished. And so somehow there's got to be a balance between the two. I mean, the new biographies of Stalin are three volumes. It will be over almost 4,000 pages. The new biography of Henry Kissinger is 1,000 pages before we even reach his appointment to government. Wow. And Kissinger and all those, and Winston Churchill's new biography is 1,200 pages. So the point is, all those people are in this book already. So I was looking for a way to achieve this quite difficult thing, the span of the world with the intimacy, the grit, the juice of individuals. And I was trying to find a way, and I looked back at what I'd done with Jerusalem when I was writing the history of Jerusalem, and this is really a companion volume to that book. And I was looking back, and I remembered that I'd used families to tell that story. There were other things I wanted to do. I wanted to tell this in a new way. I wanted it to be a new sort of world history, one that included more women and more of the female story, one that included much more diversity and was less formed by Europe and North America. And then it came to me, after many sleepless nights. If you're writers, and my publishers are actually here, you'll know that what one does as a writer is one writes a sort of four-line proposal saying, I want to write a history of the world, and I don't want it to be like any other histories of the world. And then about 2 years later, they say, where's the book? And you have to write the damn thing, and you have no clue how to do it. So at some point it came to me that I would do this through families, and I wanted to find out if that would work. So I came up with a sort of huge bit of paper on my kitchen table, and I worked out a sort of family tree of the last 5,000 years. And I really wanted to see if I could find families that would link through. And I came up with 3 mega families, and the 3 mega families were the sort of the Merovingians, then through to Charlemagne, then through to the Habsburgs, which was 1,000 years. And another one, that was Europe. And then there was the family of Genghis Khan that meandered through to Tamerlane, that meandered through to the Mughal dynasty of India. That was another 1,000 years, and that was Asia. And then the 3rd mega family was the family of the Prophet Muhammad. And so that was 3 mega dynasties, the Prophet himself, and then the Abbasids of Baghdad, the Umayyads, the Fatimids, and they go right the way through to the kings of Jordan and the kings of Morocco today. So those were the 3. So then I worked out that it would work, and then I had to start to write the book. And writing the book was, of course, a total nightmare. And since this is a Jewish audience, mainly Jewish audience, I can tell you that I basically thought I was going to die every day writing this book. And virtually, I thought I was coming down with sore throats, stomach pains. I never slept. There's not a day I didn't wake up and say, I feel terribly raw today. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. There were times I wasn't sure I was going to finish the book. And the book turned out to be much more extensive and much more challenging than I expected. I knew it was going to be long. I wanted it to be a lot long, but the people have done short books, and that's another problem. That short books are wonderful, but obviously there's very little in them. And so this amazingly has everything I want in it. And the general method is that I wanted to use families as a tether, as a harness, to tell great things in history, to make things accessible, to bring new worlds, to tell about new worlds, and to open the world, to show how the world is really the product of hybridity, of intermarriage, of worlds mixing together, and to come up with something, a coherent picture out of that. And I was pretty relieved when I finished it.
You touched on my next question a little bit about women. We think about traditional world histories, and I think in your book, women feature much more prominently. Can you talk a little bit about some of your favorite women? Can you talk a little bit about the intentionality of that as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the great thing about there's a new world of history, the way history is being written now, and basically all of it is brilliant because it's telling stuff that we should have known, that we didn't know, that we neglected, and providing one doesn't impose on the history. And this is a general point, not just a point about now, but providing one doesn't impose on history an ideological framework. There are many things that were neglected, that were left out, that should be put back. And one of those is female history and the role of female. Of course, the great thing about when I came up with the idea of families was that families are essential. Women are essential to families. Families are essential to history. The continuity of history is captured in families. Families work on so many different levels. I mean, this book has the famous family, that has many royal families, has many ruling families, but it also has families of novelists, of doctors, of executioners. It has families of undertakers, of saddle makers, of historians. It has all sorts of families in here. And the families don't have to be ruling families or distinguished families. There are enslaved families in this book. And all of them obviously feature women in a way that has been undercovered in the past. And some of the women, you realize, we've literally just missed not just female history, but great swathes of history. I mean, one small example is, at the time that we were all brought up to be studying the English Civil War, for example, James I, the time of Shakespeare, Charles I, Cromwell, who appear in the book, of course. But at the same time, Britain was like a tiny country of Northern Europe, of growing but medium importance. And at the same time, a single woman was dominating the greatest empire in the world, and we've never heard of her. And she was called Kösem Sultan, and she dominated the Ottoman Empire for about 50 years. And she was an extraordinary woman. One of the interesting things about about writing a book today in our present time is that when you write history, you've got to cut out some of the present. You don't want to just write a history book that slavishly follows the fashions of the present. But at the same time, there are a lot of things in the present that are actually very, very welcome. And one of them is the covering of slavery, for example, Atlantic slavery, slavery in American history, slavery in the Caribbean, African slavery, but also the other. I became fascinated by it because it was the subject of today, and it led me to cover many other slave trades that were going on simultaneously that we know very little about, that are hugely neglected and need to be studied more. One of them is the Black Sea, East Mediterranean, Russia-Ukraine slave trade. which may have been of a comparable size over many centuries to the Atlantic slave trade. And so many of the women that I write about were enslaved women. Kosem Sultan, who I mentioned, was an incredibly beautiful girl, probably from Greece, though many of these women were from Ukraine. Roxolana, the wife and lover and empress of Suleiman the Magnificent, was from Ukraine, and she was probably the most important Ukrainian in world history, even including Zelensky, who appears at the end of the book. What's fascinating about these women was that they were enslaved. They were taken from their families by Tartar raiders. Tartars were Mongols, basically. They were ruled by a family called the Giray family, who were descended from Genghis Khan, and they lived by slavery, and they enslaved millions of people, as did the Ottomans. Some of these girls and women were sold ultimately to the harem of the Ottoman sultans. Most of them spent their lives in that harem as maids, as helpers, as advisors, as trusted servants. A few became chosen to be lovers of the Sultan, potentially. Some of them spent one night with the Sultan and never saw him again. And some of them had sons with the Sultan, and some of them had more than one son and became empress and married the Sultan and went from an enslaved child whose parents had been killed in front of them to ruling an empire that extended for about 4 centuries from the border of Iran all the way to the border of Morocco, from Yemen to Serbia and Yugoslavia. So a colossal empire. Kosem was one of these women. She was married to the Sultan. When he died, she looked after her children, and her sons became emperors one by one. The last one was called Ibrahim the Mad, and he was only kept alive because he was regarded as insane. But in the end, she agreed to make him Sultan, Padishah, emperor of the Ottoman Empire, and of course that was a catastrophe. He had been locked up in the sort of harem without really access to women, because the women belonged to his brothers, who were the sultans, and his father. So when he became sultan, he sort of went crazy in the harem, and he had weird tastes. His tastes were essentially he loved enormously fat women, and he put out an order across the Ottoman Empire that all the fattest girls were to be sent to Istanbul. And he had a favorite one who was an Armenian girl called Sugar Cube. And he gave her massive revenues, the whole revenues of Egypt, which was the main source of income of the whole empire. And this was one of the features of his rule that led to a revolution against him. And basically his mother, Kosem, was called in, now a woman in her 50s, was called in and had to agree to his arrest, his overthrow, and ultimately his execution. Which, I mean, this book is in many ways a book about mothers. And it's a book in praise of motherhood. You'll see there are many examples in West African kingdoms, for example, where the queen mothers essentially were the rulers of the kingdoms. There was a great tradition of matriarchy in Africa. Others were like Kosem, who promoted her sons, who protected her sons, and then had to make unbearable decisions. There were others in the Indian Empire. So she's an example. In the end, she ruled, after his execution, she ruled herself in the name of her grandson until the grandson's mother started to plot against her. And by now, Kosem, who, by the way, was the most popular woman in the Ottoman Empire, loved for her charity, for her kindness, for her glamour, by then, she'd got slow, and her daughter-in-law launched a coup against her before she could launch the coup. She was hunted through the palace, through the Topkapi Palace, found behind a screen and strangled to the extent so hard that her ears bled. Wow. And so Thedai Kosem, who dominated the greatest empire on earth for almost 50 years, over 50 years, around 50 years, and who we've never heard of, but we've heard of James I and Oliver Cromwell, who are minor figures compared with her. So she's just one example. And by the way, the million-dollar question has always been like, surely if women were ruling the world, it would be a much better place. And that would be true if they were all Scandinavian prime ministers. But actually, as you'll see from the book, I've looked at them all. I've analyzed all these characters, notorious characters like Messalina and Theodora, Marozia, who ruled medieval Rome and was during a period that was traditionally known by male historians as the pornocracy, the rule of whores. In fact, she was probably the Margaret Thatcher of her day, the Hillary Clinton of her day. And you'll see that she was an extraordinary person. But I've looked through all these characters. There are many admirable female rulers in this book. And, I was very lucky that I knew Margaret Thatcher myself. And I've used my own conversations with her in the book. But you'll find in the book that female rulers are every bit as brilliant, competent, and humanitarian and philanthropic as male rulers, and every bit as cruel and inept and completely sadistic.
Well, on that note, I think maybe we'll try to open it up to some of your questions. I think some of my colleagues will be going around with microphones. So we have one question in the front with the gentleman with the blue shirt over here.
A lot of people write fiction, a lot of people write history. My question is, what do you get out of writing the novels? I read both. I read Jerusalem, I read the Romanovs, I read your Moscow trilogy. What is it that you feel you can accomplish in a novel form which you can't do in a fiction form? What kind of joy do you get out of doing one versus the other?
Well, that's a lovely question. I love writing my Moscow trilogy, which, for those of you that don't know the books, is 3 novels set in 20th century Russia, built around a Jewish family and what happens to them under Stalin, and all the way from the revolution up to the 90s. And I love writing that book because basically, you can invent everything, and that's a joy, because not being able to invent anything is a terrible straitjacket. And obviously in history books, you're very, very bound by evidence and trying to get as close to what really happened. And that means that you often it would be interesting if something was true, but oftentimes it isn't, and you have to say so. So much of what is regarded as the sort of as historical conventional wisdom is actually wrong, and challenging is a lot of fun. I've also worked in archives, which is an amazing experience, which I'll say something about in a second. But the great thing about fiction is you can write about love. Love and private life is the great subject of fiction, and it's something that you can't cover in the same way in history. But one of the lovely things about researching history, of course, is that you can work on archives, you can work in documents. That's another thrill. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the Russian archives, and I wrote about this in the novel, in fact. I mean, the bizarre thing was I spent really 10 years in Russia, in Moscow, writing and researching my Stalin books and my Romanov books. First of all, it was extraordinary what people put in letters in those days. From the Romanovs, you'll know. I mean, one of the correspondences that I found, which I really worked on, was that of Alexander II and his mistress, Katya Dolgorukaya. And that is the most extraordinary correspondence. We're used to sort of, we live in an era where people write foolish things in texts all the time. But this was the Tsar of Russia writing to his mistress. These are the most, and when I read them, and I was sitting there in an archive in Moscow, I couldn't believe it. These are literally the most sexually explicit letters I've ever read anywhere, even in the era of Donald Trump and the National Enquirer. And so the great thing about history books is if it's true, you can put it in. And a lot of what appears today, is we read about it on online or whatever. We don't know if it's true, but if it's in letters, we know it's true. And there was an amazing 500-year period of human life, basically from the Renaissance to the 1950s, really, when people wrote letters endlessly. People ruled by writing letters. Catherine the Great, Stalin, they wrote letters day and night. And those letters have mainly survived. And it means that, while nowadays we may never be able to write those letters again, we're never going to get all these emails and WhatsApps from people. People will never be able to write the kind of biographies that you've read of LBJ, my books on Stalin and the Romanovs, for example, or Catherine the Great, for example. People will never be able to write these books again. And I was very lucky that I lived in the era as a historian, that I could work on those archives and see them myself. I could smell Stalin's pipe on those letters.
Right there.
Hey, so you mentioned several of those mega families that span 1,000 years. In most cases, the founding figure of that family, was that a patriarch or a matriarch? And a following question, was there anything maybe repeating or like a pattern from which families those people came who were the founding figures in the families?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. First of all, most of them were patriarchs. Most of the families were founded by patriarchs because most of them were founded by war. And though the book is filled with female warriors and women who fought, women who commanded armies, in fact, more usually men commanded them. And so many of these empires were founded, and these dynasties were founded by men, but behind them or with them were always women. And many times that these were real partnerships, and I show that in the book. Some of the rises in the book are so extraordinary. The founder of the Ming dynasty, who founded a dynasty that ruled China for over 200 years, was literally a beggar. He literally started as a beggar. And his family was so poor that the whole family died of starvation. He became a traveling beggar. He became a warlord, and in the end, he became the emperor of the Ming dynasty, founded the Ming dynasty. So, the stories of how families work. But families are fascinating things, and I look at families in many different ways in the book. In some ways, we all have a mother and father of some description, and so there's the nuclear families, the biological families. But then, the idea of a family as a political or financial power institution is a contrived one by society. They don't exist in the way they exist, in dynasties, and the way that the succession goes through the elder son, and even on ordinary families. And by the way, we're all parts of dynasties. We're all members of dynasties. But even ordinary families, the name traditionally goes through the sons, while the daughters change their name when they get married. But of course, genetically, they're just as much related to the original family as the brothers are, as the sons are. And recently, there's been a lot of work in England, for example, on the British royal family, and revealing that the British royal family was once descended from one person who, who was involved in the slave trade, and it's just interesting because that person has now millions of descendants, and just about all of us, just about anyone who was alive in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century has literally millions of descendants. And an example of that is Genghis Khan, for example. Genghis Khan is one of the founders of families that you're asking about. Fascinating character that we know a lot about because his family wrote an official biography of him. And there are two other historians who were ministers of his family who wrote histories as well. So we know a lot about the Genghis Khan family. And, but obviously a totally brutal character. He used to sit with his generals and say, tell me, what's the greatest pleasure in life? And each general would go around and they would all come up with, they would answer whatever they answered, they would say, I love making love to women, I love hunting, I love building houses, I love building palaces. And then they would say, and tell us your greatest pleasure. And then he would say something like, my greatest pleasure is to take a city, to storm it, to take possession of all the horses, because Mongols were absolutely obsessed with horses, take possession of all the horses, to kill all the men in the city, and to make love to all the most beautiful women in the city, to take them by force. And that was his greatest pleasure. And this isn't an apocryphal story. This comes from the history written by the ministers of one of his grandsons. So this is what he said all the time. This is what he said at dinner. So those of you who are watching Succession, Mr. Roy, is really a pussycat.
I'm glad you brought it up because I've just been thinking about it for the past 20 minutes.
And by the way, Succession is going in the book. It's going in the book because obviously, and of course the Rupert Murdoch family is an interesting family that may or may not be the basis for Succession. But anyway, the point is that Genghis Khan is in many ways is exceptional character in some ways, and in another way is a typical founder of one of these dynasties, and an utterly brutal character. And I try and look in the book at what makes these people. When I was at school, I don't know if it's the same with you, but we were always taught that Hitler and Stalin were mad, and that's why they were megalomaniacs or psychopaths. But actually, it's a very unhelpful way of teaching you about these people, because we all know about 5 psychopaths in our own work, in our own offices, right? Psychopaths are very common, and we all know many of them. Then I was also told that Stalin and Hitler became mass murderers because they were beaten by their drunken fathers, which was true. But of course, everyone in the 19th century were beaten by their drunken fathers. So it's not that either. But what they do have in common is loving mothers who absolutely worship them, mothers who indulge them, mothers who did everything to make their sons successful. And I would say much more that they're the result of maternal love, excessive maternal love. And let that be a warning to you, those of you, to mothers. Yeah.
In the front row?
Thank you. I've always enjoyed your books, and I love the fact that you portray the warts as well as the good parts. But how worried are you? We say that history is written by the victors. And how worried are you when you go into an area that you're really getting the truth? I mean, what is it like to try and separate out, especially in this era, we're very worried now about history being discarded because it's not nice. How do you separate the wheat from the chaff when you look for a historical fact?
This is a great question. One of the things I wanted to write in this book, by the way, is not to write a victor's history. So I approached it in certain ways. The first thing I wanted to do was when I decided it was families. Families are a wonderful way of covering diversity. And so I decided that the rulers of Cambodia the kings, the obas of Benin, the Mani-Congos of the Congo Kingdom, I would treat them exactly as I treated the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, or the Windsors. So I also decided that in every case, even in the most progressive histories, normally they sort of begin the history when some Spaniard or Englishman arrives, or some American cavalryman arrives on the frontier. And you'll see in this book that I've meticulously started the histories of the Incas or the Benin Kingdom in West Africa or whatever. I've started it hundreds of years before any white European person arrived. So these are sort of the rules I made at the beginning of writing the book. Then I decided that it must never be a victor's history. So you'll see in the book that there are histories, I mean, yes, there are histories of the United States of America, of Russia, of the British Empire, the Mongols, the Mughals, you know, all the great families you'd expect to have, the Medicis, the Borgias, the Rothschilds are all in here. But you'll also find histories of the Sikh kingdom in what is now Pakistan, Albania, Hawaii, Haiti. You'll find the whole story of how the creation of Haiti in this book. Hawaii, Haiti, all these places that aren't sort of massive powers. But I think they're interesting, so I followed them. And of course, Ukraine is another that I follow in detail. So that's part of it. And when you say history is challenged, I mean, in a way, the strange thing about history, and the reason why it's a special responsibility to be a historian, is that, and why we're very lucky to work in the world of history, is because history has a propulsive, almost sacred power. And now that we lack religion in our increasingly secular societies, history has become even more prestigious, and people regard it as something almost holy, as if there's a truth in it, even though all history is the product of the time it's written. It shouldn't be, but it is. So, you know, history's never been so important. We saw that from President Putin's, the essay he wrote, the war he's launched, the fact that he stole Prince Potemkin's body that I laid flowers on when I wrote my book on Catherine and Potemkin. Putin has now stolen his body from Kherson in Ukraine. And this is because history has a special power. And so, do you know something? You can have too much history. The first line of my conclusion is, you can have too much history. In fact, what really matters in life, and this may be surprising from someone who's just written a world history, but what really matters in life is how people and their families want to live now. And, you know, in some ways, history can matter too much. And God save us from omnipotent history buffs.
On the end, on the aisle.
Maybe this lady in pink.
Thank you.
Yes, you're next.
What period of history fascinates you the most, and what one individual have you come to respect and revere the most?
That's a great question. You know, I mean, I've really come to love some really brave historians. You know, I was talking about how sacred history is, and though there are many there are many heroes in this book. There's Martin Luther King. There's Wilberforce, the abolitionist. There's David Ben-Gurion. You know, there's Margaret Thatcher. There's Thomas Jefferson. There are amazing characters in this book, and it's absolutely filled with them. But, you know, oftentimes one remembers that history is kind of a lot of fun talking about it here in New York or in London, in our democracies. But I was reminded when I was on tour in South Africa just a few weeks ago, I was called by one of the people who'd helped me write my book on Stalin. And the secret police had just raided his apartment in the middle of the night, like at 3 in the morning. and woken his family. And I was reminded that, you know, history is a lot of fun for me, but it is a sacred task. And, you know, in places like China and Belarus and Russia, it's a really dangerous job. And so some of the real heroes in this book, some of the people I most admire are writers. I love Samuel Pepys. For this book, I read the whole of his diaries, many thousands of pages. Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't read Pepys, read Pepys. It is a masterpiece and fascinating. But, you know, I'm really reminded of Sima Qian when you ask about great men. Sima Qian was the 1st century BC Chinese historian who was writing a world history. And he fell out with his emperor, the Han Emperor of China. And the emperor offered him, and he was the official historian of the imperial family, but he offered him a choice: execution or castration. And Sima Qian chose castration. And he said, I chose this, he wrote a letter which I kept on my desk when I was writing this book, by the way. And he said, I chose this terrible mutilation. And by the way, you know, when you were castrated, there's a lot about castrations, but eunuchs are very important, even in a book about family. And, you know, the figures are unclear, but something between 60 and 90% of people who were castrated died not of blood loss, but of infection. And this book is in many ways about the advances in medicine that changed world history and made population grow. But anyway, he said, Sima Qian wrote a letter, which I kept on my desk when I wrote this, and he said, I chose this terrible mutilation in order to finish my world history. And he said, my dream is that this world history will be read in villages, in cities, and in foreign lands. And of course, I mean, he lived and he finished his history, and that history is still read today in China and by Chinese scholars. And it's still regarded as a masterpiece. And I just want to reassure you, ladies and gentlemen, that I finished my book without having to face this sort of dilemma.
Thank God.
And I did finish writing the world intact. But the historians, the writers, they're the heroes because they risked everything to try and find the truth. And that is the mission of historians.
I think in the pink, in the third row. Thanks.
How do you think your experience as a war correspondent affects how you write about war as an historian? Do you find moments of vividness, or does it remain more abstract?
Well, that's such a good question. I was incredibly lucky among historians that I was able to witness, that I was able to see the breakup of the Soviet Union and to be in all the wars. I was working as an investment banker in New York at the time, and when the Soviet Union began to break up, I thought, like, I've studied this all my life. I have to be there. So I called up a bed and breakfast. I found a bed and breakfast company, and I said to them, I want to go to, they said, we basically just do Leningrad and Moscow. I said, no, I want to do Leningrad, Moscow, but I want to do Tbilisi and Tashkent and Samarkand and Baku and all these places. And they said, well, we've never done that, but we'll arrange it. So I went, and every single city I arrived in, I met my family on the first day, civil war broke out on the second day, and a coup was launched. I got to know all the presidents and the leaders of the rebels and the warlords. I was incredibly privileged to see these amazing things. And there's no better training for a historian than to see a great empire fall. And I was very lucky to see that. I've put some of the stories in the book because they were relevant. I got to know people like Edward Shevardnadze, who was Gorbachev's foreign minister and then president of Georgia. And I flew round with him. I was in Chechnya. I was in the Karabakh War, which has recently restarted. I saw amazing things. I remember once I was sitting with the president of Georgia, Gamsakurdia, who was a Shakespearean scholar, elected president. And we were discussing, as you do with presidents in funny places, we were discussing Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra, Hamlet. But his story began to resemble more like a sort of Julius Caesar or King Lear. And there was while I was meeting with him, there was a rebellion against him. And I said to him, you know, he was going out to, he said, I'm going to go and address my troops outside the window from the balcony of the presidential palace. And I noticed that on his desk was this huge satellite phone, because there were no mobiles, and this is in 1991. So I said to Mr. President, is there any chance, it's very great fun discussing Shakespeare with you, but I will need to phone my mother. And I said, can I use your satellite phone? He said, sure, sit in the throne, he said. He used the word throne. He said, sit in the throne, you can ring your mother. So I rang my mother, and I said to her, Mom, and she went, where are you? There's a civil war going on in the Caucasus. Where are you? I said, well, Mom, I'm right at the center of it. I'm with the president. He's besieged in his palace, and I'm phoning you from his desk. So she said to me, you've got to get out of there immediately. This is terrible. Then she said, what's that noise in the background? And Gamsakurdia was addressing his followers from the balcony. He was shouting. They were shooting in the air. She said, sounds like Hitler. I said, well, it's the local version. I said, and so that was kind of the experience that really, is a very good training. But in the end, I had experiences on those trips that made you realize how world affairs are made by people who really don't know what's happening. When I got back to Moscow, I remember I was debriefed by MI6, but I was also debriefed by the State Department, by the CIA in the American Embassy. And I went into this sort of secret room, and I was briefed. And at one point, the guy said to me, he said, I'm going to ask you I need a frank answer. Did you see any nuclear warheads on your journey? And I realized that the CIA had no clue what was happening to the nuclear warheads out in the Caucasus and in the Soviet Empire. And of course, intelligence is everything. So, I had amazing experiences out there. I remember driving across the mountains of the Caucasus with a warlord with these kind of jeeps full of kind of bodyguards. And I remember he said to me, we need a bit of music. So he took a cassette out and he put it into the player. And these loudspeakers, we were racing through these little villages in the Caucasus where old men with moustaches who all looked exactly like Stalin, walked out of their small cottages. And he started to play Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, incredibly loudly. And I realized, and just one more sort of story just make you realize what an amazing experience it was out there. I was in the Ossetian War. Again, Ossetia is still a frozen conflict going on now. I was invited to go to the funeral of 4 young boys who'd been killed in the fighting, and it was like a movie. We were on the top of these incredible mountains, and there was this table laid, covered in piled high with food and sort of delicious delicacies and wine and carafes, and the men laid their guns, Kalashnikovs, against a tree, and we all sat down, and we ate, and we had toast, and I got more and more drunk. I was on my own. I was 25. I was in the middle of a war, and I stood up and made toasts, and everyone drank, and we threw back more, and we ate more food, and the day got longer, and the sun began to sink. And after a while, I said, by the way, when did they bury the 4 boys from the village who were killed? And they said, we haven't buried them. This is their funeral. I said, but where are they? He lifted up the tablecloth, and they were under the table.
Maybe on this side, right here, on the aisle.
Thank you. Do you deal with prehistory, and do you deal with evolutionary history at all?
Yeah, good question. Yes, I do, because I think if you write a world history, a history of humanity, you have to begin at the beginning. It's incredibly complicated. And Yeah, but I do. Yeah, I begin right at the beginning.
This gentleman right here.
I've really enjoyed this exchange. It's wonderful. I'd like to turn to history as it's being unfolded presently. And with your background in and experience in Russia and the archives you were able to have access to, probably today you would not be able to see so easily. What is happening now, the history between Russia and Ukraine, how do you see that scenario play out? Is this going to be essentially a war of attrition? Do you think that at some point Putin will be overthrown? What's your feeling coming from that background that you have, that historical view of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I believe, I mean, no one knows the answer to that question, of course. But, you know, essentially I've studied it very closely. And I've sort of studied the way that that Putin sees Ukraine. I mean, various things could play out. First of all, I mean, I think it's entirely possible that that Russia is totally defeated in this war and faces an absolutely unprecedented destruction of Russian forces. And that is entirely possible if we arm Ukraine enough, as we should, I believe. And if that happens, then the Putin regime will fall, and Putin will be destroyed by an internal coup. Russian rulers are virtually never overthrown by popular movements. There are virtually no cases of it. And this is because all Russian rulers deploy massive security forces that are usually loyal. You may be thinking of Nicholas I when you, as an example. Actually, there were massive crowds in Petrograd. They could have been put down by military forces. And the reason why they weren't was because the army deposed Nicholas II. Even though one always thinks the February Revolution as crowds calling for bread. Actually, that is another example of a military coup. The fear of military coup is one reason why Putin has so mismanaged this war. He is so afraid of his generals that he has interfered with everything, with every detail, and never allowed a single general the power to manage the war, which will be his undoing. I mean, what he desperately needs is a General Georgy Zhukov, who Stalin in the end found. Putin is a student of history. He's not a great intellectual like Stalin was, who read everything, but he reads biographies of Russian rulers. And I think just as Stalin spent a lot of time reading about 1812 in 1941, I think that he will now be reading a lot about Stalin in 1941. And you've got to remember that Stalin in 1941 lost over 6 million men. 6 million. Putin's only lost about 300,000. And these people don't care about their own people. They regard them as the sort of screws of history. So you've got to look at Stalin. And Stalin, after a year of disaster, absolute disaster, learnt how to be a highly efficient supreme commander. It doesn't look like that's going to happen with Putin, but it's possible. At the same time, Stalin was becoming an incredibly competent supreme commander. Hitler, by the way, was going the opposite and becoming a dogmatic, isolated meddler who became more and more disastrous. So defeat is possible, but much more likely is what you hint at, is a sort of stalemate. And we've seen lots of these conflicts. A stalemate would yield a peace, an armistice, not unlike what happened with Pakistan and India, which led to 4 further wars, or with the Israel and the Arab countries. And as you can see with Israel and the Arab countries, 4 big wars, and in the end, the borders became the accepted international borders. That could happen with Ukraine and Russia. And in that case, if it was a stalemate, Putin would be able to claim some sort of victory. He could still point to Crimea. He could probably point to some gains in the east, in the Donbass. There's also, remember, the moving target, the moving situation in Belarus, where Lukashenko is clearly ill at the moment. If he dies or becomes incapacitated, that country may well be somehow encompassed by Russia, and could be another gain for Putin. Anyway, the likelihood is, I would say, something like 30% total defeat of Russia and the fall of Putin, 70% a stalemate, which will lead to further wars over time, but will in the end establish Ukraine as what I call in the book a war democracy. War democracies like Taiwan, like Israel, like South Korea, a country that's highly mobilized and yet is a democracy. And that is the most likely scenario. It will join the EU. It will become part of the European system. But most probably it will face periodic challenges from Russia. But if Putin falls completely, it is possible that Russia will either break up or to become a democracy. These things are possible. We think of these states as unchangeable, immutable objects. But when you write a world history like this, you've got to remember, there was a time in the medieval times when Poland, Lithuania was the biggest country in Europe and ruled from the Baltic to the Black Sea. There were times when the Tatar Khanate of Crimea ruled South Ukraine. There are kingdoms that vanish all the time and break up. This can happen. So we're entering a period of that we can contrast. The Cold War was like a chess game. The period of American unipolarity was like a game of solitaire. We're now in a multiplayer computer game, and everything is different now. The 70-year peace that we knew is over. Many of the gains we won, the things that became taboo, like anti-Semitism after 1945, the gains we won in the great liberal reformation of gay rights and female rights, all these things will have to be refought for again. We can take nothing for granted. We're in a new era.
Well, I've been told that we're pretty much done, but I do have one last question that perhaps came from the audience, perhaps did not. If you could tell us a little bit about your recent experience at the coronation of King Charles III.
Oh. That's a very nice way to end things. I should say, I'm not completely pessimistic about the world. It may sound like I am. I do believe, and I finished the book on a note of optimism. The book covers pandemics and the fall of empires and tragedies and cruelty upon cruelty, but human ingenuity, creativity, and yes, family love has solved a lot of things, and I believe that we will solve the problems we face today. I'm ultimately optimistic, despite everything, and despite the fact that we face more dangers now than we ever have before. And I should say, the one constant in human nature from the most ancient times is a belief that the world is about to end. So nothing changes, right? And the coronation is a very nice way to finish this. I should say, this is a book that studies, among other different manifestations of family, it studies the power family. And there are many sorts of power family now. We think that we're living in a very secular, very rational period of liberal democracies, certainly in our countries, in Western Europe and North America. But actually, we're living in a period of family power resurgence all over Asia, in Africa, in many countries. And after all, this is the country of the Trump dynasty, after all. So family power is far from over. But in democracies, you have demo dynasties, like the Bushes, like the Trudeaus, and many other examples where you can elect a family leader, but you can get rid of them too, as you should. then there are many cases of what are really republic monarchies, like in North Korea with the Kims, like in Syria with the Assads, and there are many other examples. And the third example is the constitutional monarchies, which have all sorts of irrational and traditional and even magical aspects, and yet work very well in Northern Europe as part of democracies, and which prevent overmighty presidencies that you see in places like Turkey, and you can see when Donald Trump is president of America too. So there's something to be said for these constitutional monarchies, strange as they may be. But anyway, our constitutional monarchy in Britain kind of works in its own idiosyncratic way. And I'm very lucky that I know the King of England quite well. He's an extraordinary person. And so I was very lucky that I was invited to the coronation. And it was the most fascinating day, as you can imagine. We had to get up at 6 a.m. in the morning. We had to wait for 3 hours in the Abbey. My wife bought a new dress, as you can imagine. It was the most fascinating day. We sat opposite all the prime ministers and foreign dignitaries. Your First Lady, Dr. Biden, was there. And we were in a section where I guess it was sort of friends of the King and Queen sat. And we could see about 80% of what was happening. Samuel Pepys went to the coronation of Charles II in 1861, and he climbed up onto a scaffolding at 4 a.m. in the morning and tried to see what he could, but he actually said he couldn't see a single thing that happened. And in the end, he gave up and went for a pee. And so we weren't reduced to that. We saw a lot of what happened. I found it, by the way, first of all, it was incredibly social in where we were sitting. We were very lucky. We were sitting with some fascinating friends of the King and Queen. Many of them were actors. Dame Judi Dench, Dame Maggie Smith, Stephen Fry, Tom Stoppard. So we were sitting with some pretty interesting people, and there was a great sense of fun. Everyone was talking, everyone was laughing. And then when it began, we were told to sit down at about 10 o'clock. And at 11 o'clock, the ceremony started. It was extremely moving in all sorts of ways. The music was astonishing. The crowns glittered and gleamed in a way that you just can't imagine on television. And everyone was almost choked up with tears at the climax of it. When Zadok the priest was played, and the king was undressed and crowned and robed again and given the orb and scepter. It was really an extraordinary thing. And I have to say, as a friend of the king, I was thrilled for him that it went so well. It was a terrifying ordeal, really, for them to go through. So much could go wrong. So many things could fall. There were so many moving parts that could have gone extremely wrong. As a British person, I was proud, actually, because it's part of our democracy, strange and idiosyncratic as it is. And as a friend, I was just delighted for him. So, and I should say, as a historian, I was just delighted to witness, one of the great historical moments of our time. Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you so much. Book is in the back. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Very much for that great event. Thank you.